The day my son said those words, I felt something inside me go quiet, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet in a way that scared me more than shouting ever could. He stood there, avoiding my eyes, his voice careful, measured, as if he were delivering a message he didn't want to own. Mom, my business partner doesn't like you. Basically, you're not welcome here. And for a second, my mind refused to accept what my ears had heard. I waited for him to smile or correct himself or say he didn't mean it that way. But nothing followed, only silence, heavy and final. And in that moment, I understood a painful truth that many parents experience but few talk about. Sometimes, the deepest wounds don't come from enemies. They come from the people you raised with love. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of the years I struggled. Because when your own child distances himself from you, pride disappears and dignity becomes the only thing you can hold on to. I simply nodded, and that nod carried decades of sacrifice. I remembered the nights I stayed awake listening for his breathing when he was sick, the mornings I skipped meals so he could have better shoes, the times I told him he was capable even when I wasn't sure how we would survive. Back then his dreams were fragile, nothing impressive to the world, just ideas, notebooks, late nights, and hope. And I was always there, not as an investor, not as a partner, just as someone who believed when belief had no return. But success has a strange way of rewriting relationships. It doesn't just change bank balances, it changes behavior, priorities, and sometimes respect. After he left that day, the house felt unfamiliar, like a place I no longer belonged. I sat alone replaying his words again and again. Not welcome. Not welcome where? In his office, in his future, in his life. That sentence hurt more than any insult a stranger could give. Because strangers don't owe you loyalty. Your children do. I thought about how he used to hold my hand tightly when crossing the street, afraid to let go, and now he had let go without even realizing it. That night I cried quietly, not because I was weak, but because I finally saw the cost of building your entire identity around supporting someone else. When they no longer need you, you feel invisible, and that invisibility can either destroy you or force you to discover who you are beyond being needed. I asked myself a question that kept me awake until morning. If I am no longer useful to the person I gave my life to, then who am I? And that question was terrifying. But it was also the beginning of something powerful, because pain doesn't arrive to end your story. It arrives to redirect it. And even though I didn't know it yet, that moment of rejection was the first step toward reclaiming my self-respect, my voice, and a life that would no longer depend on anyone's permission. I didn't hear the news from my son, and that was the first sign that something fundamental had shifted between us. Because when people are still emotionally connected, they share their victories instinctively, but this victory came to me indirectly, casually mentioned by someone else as if it were common knowledge. Did you hear? Your son's company secured investment from $1 million firm. And for a moment I just sat there nodding, pretending it didn't shake me, pretending it didn't hurt that such a life-changing milestone had passed without a word to me. $1 million is not just money, it is influence, it is authority, it is the kind of validation that makes people believe they are untouchable. And suddenly the distance, the cold professionalism, the careful way my son spoke to me all made sense. Money had entered his life in a big way. And with it came a new set of rules. New people, new priorities. I congratulated him later with a short message, simple and sincere. Because despite everything I was still his mother, he replied hours later with 2 polite words, and that small exchange confirmed what I had been trying not to admit. I was no longer part of his inner world. I remembered the early days when his company was nothing more than an idea and a laptop that overheated. When rejection letters piled up and self-doubt sat heavy on his shoulders, when he questioned whether he was smart enough or strong enough to succeed, and I was there for all of it, not with money, not with connections, but with belief, with patience, with encouragement when no one else was listening. But success has a way of changing the language people speak. Conversations turn into transactions. Relationships become strategic, and suddenly emotions are seen as liabilities. I saw it clearly when he came by briefly one evening, dressed sharper, speaking faster, talking about investors, image, and growth, as if he were reading from a script. And then he said, almost casually, "Mom, you wouldn't understand this world. it's business. And in that moment, something inside me shifted because I realized it wasn't business that separated us. It was fear. Fear of appearing small in front of powerful people. Fear of being reminded of a time when he needed help. Fear of humility in a world that worships dominance. I didn't argue with him. I didn't remind him of sacrifices, because true strength doesn't beg to be remembered. Instead, I listened. And when he left, I sat alone with a clarity I had never felt before. I understood that I had been shrinking myself to stay close to someone who was growing away from me. And that kind of love is not healthy. It is selfish. That night, I made a quiet decision, not fueled by anger or revenge, but by self-respect. I decided I would stop waiting to be welcomed, stop measuring my worth by someone else's success. I would build a life where dignity was not optional and respect was not conditional. I started small, learning, reading, rebuilding confidence that had been neglected for years. While my son chased valuation and recognition, I invested in myself. Not loudly, not publicly, but consistently, and with every small step forward. I felt something return to me that I had lost without realizing it, my sense of self, my voice, my strength, and I began to understand a truth that many people learn too late. Money can elevate your status, but only character sustains your soul. And although my son had gained $1 million investment, I was gaining something far more valuable: independence from needing anyone's approval. And this was only the beginning of a transformation that neither of us could yet fully see. The changes in my life didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen loudly. There were no announcements, no celebrations, no one clapping from the sidelines. It was just me waking up each day and choosing not to disappear, choosing not to let rejection define the rest of my life. I started with discipline because discipline is the quiet foundation of confidence. I organized my days, set small goals, forced myself to learn things I had once believed were no longer meant for someone my age. And at first it felt uncomfortable, even embarrassing, but growth often does, especially when it comes after years of putting yourself last. Slowly people began to notice a change in me, not because I talked about it, but because energy doesn't lie. When you stop begging for space and start owning it, the world responds differently. Opportunities began to appear in subtle ways. Conversations turned into connections, connections turned into work, and for the first time in a long while, I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with being someone's mother. I began advising younger people, helping them think clearly, avoid mistakes I had already lived through, and they listened, not because I was powerful, but because I was honest. And honesty carries weight in a world full of noise. While my son's company continued to grow publicly, my growth happened privately, but real growth always does. One evening he called me unexpectedly, his voice different, less rushed, more human. He asked how I was doing, and when I told him I was busy working on my own projects, there was a pause on the line, the same kind of pause I had noticed before, but this time it felt different, curious instead of dismissive. I could sense that something in him was unsettled. Success had given him everything except peace. Pressure from investors, expectations, constant performance, and the fear of falling short had begun to weigh on him. He didn't say it directly, but I could hear it between his words. And for the first time in a long time, our conversation wasn't about his business. It was about life. And that's when I realized something powerful. When you stop chasing people, they start wondering why they lost access to you. I didn't feel proud or victorious. I felt calm, because calm is what comes when you finally stand on your own feet. And in that calm, I understood that my worth had never been tied to his success or his failure. I was whole before his company existed, and I would remain whole regardless of where his journey led. That realization changed the way I listened, the way I spoke, the way I showed up in the world. And although my son had not apologized and the distance had not completely disappeared, something had shifted, not in him alone, but in me. I no longer needed recognition to feel validated. I no longer needed permission to exist fully, and that quiet strength became the foundation for everything that came next. Because when you rebuild yourself from the inside, life eventually responds on the outside. And this chapter of growth was only preparing me for a moment that would test everything I had learned about dignity, boundaries, and unconditional support. By the time I reached the point where my own projects were growing, I realized something I had never truly understood before. Success is meaningless if it costs your peace of mind. While my son's company was thriving with its investors and million-dollar deals, I was thriving in a different currency: clarity, resilience, and self-respect. I no longer measured my worth by someone else's approval or a title on a door. I measured it by the quiet confidence I felt when I looked in the mirror each morning. One day my son came by unannounced, hesitant, the way people approach something they aren't sure they deserve. He looked at me differently, not with condescension or avoidance, but with curiosity and a hint of respect. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't have to, because I didn't need that to validate myself anymore. Our conversation that day was brief, honest, and human. He talked about challenges he hadn't shared before, about the weight of expectations, about mistakes he wished he could take back, and I listened without judgment, offering insight from experience rather than resentment. And in that exchange I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known when I was simply defined by my role as a parent. I had transformed rejection into motivation, distance into self-discovery, and silence into clarity. The truth I learned through all of it is simple but powerful. You cannot control how others treat you. You cannot dictate where they welcome you, but you can control how you respond. You can choose to shrink or you can choose to rise. And rising doesn't mean defeating anyone else. It means honoring yourself, nurturing your own growth, and building a life where dignity and respect are non-negotiable. In the end, I didn't just survive the rejection or the absence of acknowledgement. I thrived because I chose to invest in myself, and that decision created a ripple effect, not just in my life, but in the way my son began to see me, not just as his mother, but as a person with strength, experience, and unshakable self-worth. And that is the ultimate lesson. Life will push you, people may leave or dismiss you, success may appear without you, but the moment you stop needing permission to exist fully, you become unstoppable, and no amount of money, power, or influence can ever take that away.